Anyway, to give you a little bit of information, she is the Distinguished Research Professor of Geography at UCLA. She's authored over 100 research articles and 2 books. Black Rice, The African Origins of Rice Cultivation in the Americans. And she received the Melville Herskovits Book Award, In the Shadow of Slavery, Africa's Botanical Legacy in the Atlantic World. Congratulations for that, by the way. Let's see, I'm sorry, I lost my place. Professor Carney is an elected member of the British Academy, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and fellow of the Association of American Geographers, for whom she has also received a Distinguished Scholarship honor, the Historical Geography Award, the Netting Award for Geography and Anthropology, and the Sauer Distinguished Scholarship Award. Her research has been supported by the National Geographic Society, John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, American Council of Learned Societies, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Venner Gren Foundation, and the Rachel Carlson Center for Environment and Society. So please join me in welcoming Judith Carney. Oops.
Thank you, Patricia. Can everybody hear me all right? Yep. Okay. I may be live, but I'm not as lively as you, Jason. So you're a tough act to follow. And I knew it when I saw the program. But thank you, Patricia, for the generous introduction. And all of us, as you can see, are picking up your idea of taking a new lens to the familiar and also showing various ways by which we can amplify the archive and the limitations that we find, those of us who work with archives. And what I'd like to focus on today actually is to build a story around my own research over the past 30 years and the ideas I've drawn from it. And we heard earlier today from Mark Harris about in a wonderful lecture, about the literary and theoretical works that has inspired his brilliant exhibition, but many of our own work, as we've talked today, but without calling out everybody in the interest of time. And you can see, as is evidence, our collective homage to Sylvia Wynter and her groundbreaking work by emphasizing the plot versus the plantation, oral histories for enabling us to think outside the limitations of the archive. And what I would like to do, and I'm not an artist, but to use images and paintings to sort of fill in some of the things we've talked about today to present my own storytelling narrative of my life in the academy and my PhD work and beyond in West Africa, Brazil, and other parts of tropical America. Okay, so I'll be a little more formal because otherwise I will be here a long time and you'll cut me off. So a defining feature of food production in the 21st century is the rapid expansion of large-scale plantation agriculture across the New and Old World tropics. Plantations are back, and it speaks to the resurgence of large-scale monocultures in tropical lands, reminding us of the plantation's advent in the New World some 5 centuries ago. And indeed, plantations such as this oil palm plantation you see here have so influenced land use futures that the term plantationocene, as an alternative to the term Anthropocene, is used to underscore the biodiversity loss, but also the racial tensions that continue in our time with a renewed emphasis on monocultures. Oil palm plantations are expanding across Colombia, Brazil, Indonesia, Cameroon, and elsewhere. Soybeans now cover some 60 million hectares of South America. But plantation agriculture is devastating tropical and subtropical biomes where our globe's richest biodiversity is concentrated. It is accelerating extinctions of plant and animal species, and of particular concern for our collective food futures, monocultures are sweeping aside alternative farming systems that practice agrobiodiversity. These include not only food systems developed by native peoples, but also those with origins in Africa. So my focus today is the New World tropics, where many of these imperiled land use systems have a compelling history. In particular, I'd like to discuss a distinctive food system that the enslaved themselves forged in the shadow of colonial plantation societies, which were devoted to growing highly profitable export crops such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, indigo, and rice. For the enslaved workforce who grew and harvested these commodity crops, food insecurity was a brutal fact of daily existence. Overworked and underfed, the enslaved took to growing their own food in the small yards around their dwellings. In this image of a Caribbean sugar plantation, you will see the slave village on the right, their huts surrounded by fruit trees and diverse vegetation. Other paintings and documents from the plantation period, as we shall see, affirm the presence of a different food order, one based on subsistence, hiding in plain sight within the plantation monoculture. After the abolition of slavery, this subaltern agricultural strategy evolved into the Afrodescendant smallholder farming system widely practiced to the present day. A defining feature of this alternative food system is the number of plants that are of African provenance. Excuse me for the long chart, but there are a lot of plants. Notable introductions from Africa include sorghum, millet, yams, okra, the oil palm, cola of Coca-Cola, black-eyed peas, sesame. Each and every one of these food plants was domesticated in Africa thousands of years ago. Some on this list, notably taro, pigeon peas, and plantains, are actually of Asian origin, but they were adopted into African food systems in prehistory through ancient Indian Ocean trade networks. And of course, rice, African rice, appears on the list of plant introductions. Most of us think of rice as a distinctly Asian crop, but we now know that West Africans independently domesticated a separate species of rice more than 3,000 years ago. This African species, with the scientific name of Oryza glaberrima, was a major food staple of the region between Senegal and Ghana. These African crop introductions to plantation societies raised then an interesting question. How did these food staples arrive in the New World and become key components of the subaltern food system developed by the enslaved? And what I'd like to do to answer this and related questions is to make these points. First, that the enslaved were forced to plant export crops like cotton, tobacco, sugar, and rice, but they also grew food for survival. And in this talk, my emphasis will be on subsistence or sustenance crops rather than on the export crop. And this emphasis leads us to the importance of food grown in Africa for provisioning slave ships to New World plantation societies. Next, I'll discuss the agency of enslaved Africans in instigating the cultivation of familiar African foods on their humble food plots and creolizing them with Amerindian staples. Fourth, this food system also supported fugitive slave communities, the ones we've talked about, Maroons or Quilombos, as they're known in Portuguese. And they informed the Black farming strategies that developed after abolition. And lastly, the African introductions give the foodways of the African diaspora their defining culinary signature. So let us now step back some 5 centuries to the initial period of European maritime expansion and the beginnings of New World plantation economies. The decades following 1492 were momentous on several levels, not only because Europeans arrived in the Americas and began wars of conquest and colonization, but also because European maritime expansion between the 16th and 19th centuries led to the unprecedented exchange of plants, animals, and microbes between several continents. This movement of species, both intentional and unintentional, seen and unseen, historian Alfred Crosby famously termed the Columbian Exchange. But Crosby was not merely interested in novel Amerindian species that naturalists brought back to Europe, such as tomatoes, potatoes, and maize. Crosby was also drawing attention to the food, plants, and animals that European migrants introduced from their homelands. He significantly recognized that the agents of botanical and biological transfers were not only men of science, but could be ordinary people as well. However, over the same period as the Columbian Exchange, yet another significant intercontinental transfer of species was taking place. And in this instance, the plant transfers involved tropical crops from Africa, while the agents of plant establishment were African and enslaved. These African plant introductions were unlike any other discussed in the Columbian Exchange literature because they arrived as a direct consequence of the transatlantic slave trade, which between the 16th and 19th centuries involved some 36,000 slave voyages and the forced migration of 12.5 million Africans to the Americas. One of the striking features of the plantation era is the number of European accounts that credit the enslaved with the introduction of specific foods, all previously African food staples. We can identify several plants that naturalists and visitors to plantation societies claimed slaves introduced. These include yams, sorghum, millet, rice, sesame, black-eyed and pigeon peas, taro, the kola nut, and okra. If we take at their word commentaries penned by prominent historical figures such as Willem Piso and Georg Markgraf, naturalists on the first scientific expedition to Brazil in the 1640s, Thomas Jefferson, and others who made these claims, we might ask, how is it possible that slaves introduced crops to the Americas? After all, Africans were brought to plantation societies in bondage and without personal possessions. Crediting enslaved Africans with plant introductions attributes to them an agency that is entirely at odds with long-standing assumptions. So why would these historical witnesses claim otherwise? During the transatlantic slave trade, Africa, in fact, often produced surplus food. Captives awaiting shipment to the New World were frequently put in charge of growing crops that could be sold as provisions for the Atlantic crossing, also known as the Middle Passage. These were typically African cultivars, since the European staples, wheat, rye, and oats, grew poorly in the tropics. And here we see food fields fronting an English slave fort in what is present-day Ghana. From an early period, Europeans took note of the distinctive way in which food was prepared in Africa. This detail of a Portuguese navigational map from 1633 features a glyph of, of a Portuguese slaveholding fortress. And to the right, you will see two figures pictured who are performing the traditional African method of hand milling grain with a mortar and pestle, a task long associated with female work in Africa. Slave ships carried some food supplies from Europe, but captains also relied on African surpluses to feed the enslaved captives across the Middle Passage. The slave ship voyage could last 6 weeks or months, so sufficient food stores were vital, and captains of slave ships purchased African grains such as rice, sorghum, and millet, as well as Amerindian maize and peanuts, which had been introduced to Africa in the early 16th century. Europeans commonly believed slave mortality would be reduced if captives were fed food to which they were accustomed. Often the grain that slavers purchased was unmilled, that is to say, with the grain's inedible hulls or husks still attached. And this distinction I am making between milled and unmilled grain is really quite important because, and significantly, any unmilled grain is also a seed, which also means any unmilled grain remaining from a slave voyage could potentially serve as seed for growing it elsewhere. So, as Africans arrived in the Americas, so did African food staples. These soon appeared in the food gardens the enslaved planted for their subsistence. How did this happen? An oral history told by Maroons, the descendants of runaway slaves, offers an intriguing explanation. Maroons live in remote communities across South America and in Jamaica as well, and a few other Caribbean island sites, and they grow rice. They have long maintained rice is a crop that Africans introduce. Across the Guianas and Amazonic Brazil, Maroons claim their ancestors, and I should note it's always an enslaved female ancestor in their telling. These females smuggled grains of rice off the slave ship, and this, their descendants say, is how we came to grow rice. But to serve as seed, the smuggled grains could only have been rice with its hulls still attached, that is, rice not yet milled. During slave voyages, any grain that was put on the ship in unmilled form required the subsequent removal of its indigestible hulls prior to consumption. And to carry out this task, slave ship captains at times relied on the traditional African mortar and pestle milling method and the labor of enslaved females to perform this task, in the way that we saw depicted in a previous slide. So, close examination of this 18th century painting of the Danish slave ship Fredensborg provides compelling context for this Maroon oral history. This is a remarkable painting if one looks carefully at a small detail near the stern or the rear of the ship along its quarterdeck behind the barricade where we know enslaved women were kept on slave ships. Right there. For it illustrates something that is too often missing from historical accounts of slave ship voyages. And I've added the highlighting here. The highlighted view clearly shows two enslaved figures with handheld pestles milling grain in the traditional African way in a wooden mortar. They are certainly females, not just because milling is traditionally a woman's task, but we see it taking place in the rear of the ship where female captives were held and at times put to work preparing food. We don't know if the women in this image are hand milling sorghum, millet, or rice, but we do know that not one of these African crops was present in the Americas prior to the arrival of European slavers and enslaved Africans. Certainly, most slave ships did not arrive in plantation societies with leftover food stores, but those that occasionally did presented female captives an opportunity to access seeds and rootstock of familiar foods and the possibility to establish them anew. This painting, then, of one slave ship lends striking support to the maroon oral history, revealing that women were indeed in a position to take unmilled grains, seed rice, off of slave ships. And with this next slide, I'd like to turn to a point that Mark Harris made earlier today about smuggled seeds and smuggled knowledge. How did these women do so? The maroon oral history recounts how women hid rice grains in their hair before disembarking the slave ship. And here, Edith Ajako, a female maroon in French Guiana, shows Dutch ethnobotanist Tindy van Andel how this was done. Edith demonstrates the technique with her daughter Onika by braiding grains in her hair one by one until they can no longer be seen. And if you have an opportunity to see this 8-minute video, it's very powerful and beautifully done. Central to this maroon oral history of rice introduction is the significance then of slave ships and enslaved women for seed transfers from Africa. It substitutes the agents of global seed transfers celebrated in the standard Columbian exchange account, that is to say, European navigators, colonists, naturalists, and men of science, with the agency of enslaved African women whose deliberate efforts to smuggle seeds of preferred foods reestablished African foodways such as rice-based dishes in New World plantation societies. Professor Van Endel's research brings additional scientific credibility to the maroon oral history of rice introduction to plantation societies. In 2010, she encountered African rice still being cultivated in Suriname's maroon communities, where elsewhere it had long been replaced by higher yielding Asian rice, which is more amenable to mechanical milling than the African type. Her fieldwork and subsequent genetic and ethnobotanical studies since then links rice introductions back to Africa and the transatlantic slave trade. So learning, we didn't even know there was for sure a separate species of rice, until colonial botanists started going to Africa at the end of the 19th century, many of them who had worked already in Southeast Asia, and said this rice looks a lot different than what we've seen in Thailand, what is today Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam. Maybe it's a separate species. And as we know, the scientific debates around these things go on for decades and they have to be tested. And finally, by the middle of the 20th century, it was indeed confirmed that this was an independent species. So until then, No one thought that this rice that had been grown along the African coast had been there before Portuguese navigators arrived carrying it from Asia. So it's a very interesting story. Okay. So Professor Van Endel's research brings additional credibility to the Maroon oral history, and she encountered this rice still being cultivated by Suriname's, in this group, Saramacca communities, where elsewhere it had been replaced by Asian rice. And her subsequent work with geneticists traces this area back to the rice, traces this rice back to the indigenous rice area of West Africa. So what I'd like to do now is to turn to the sites in plantation societies through these paintings, that we can take another look at them, where the enslaved established African dietary staples. So they planted subsistence crops in the yards surrounding their dwellings, the dooryard gardens that Jason mentioned and others, and on plantation land unsuited to commodity production, marginal land. In this image, the slave quarters can be seen in the forested area behind the sugar mill. But what appears in this image as a forest is actually a food forest. The trees are likely fruit trees which formed an integral component of the food system that the enslaved developed for subsistence. This painting provides an eye-level view of a slave dooryard or kitchen garden. The area around the dwelling was planted to a diverse array of food crops, some Amerindian and some African, and I've identified a few here. By bringing together or creolizing the plant heritages of Africa and the New World tropics, the enslaved created a distinctive food system in plantation societies. In contrast to the dominant plantation monoculture, theirs emphasized an agrobiodiverse polyculture. And by polyculture, I'm referring to the systematic interplanting of seeds, tubers, legumes, vegetables, and fruit trees. This agricultural strategy mimics the tangled vegetative architecture of a tropical forest, in that a medley of diverse plants growing together offers protection from insect predation, heavy downpours, and subsequent or concomitant soil erosion. Planting a polyculture is a proven way of producing food in tropical climates where there are no cold seasons to purge the environment of predators and pathogens. This slide shows two other kinds of sites where enslaved people grew their food. On the right side is a sketch of a plantation's provision grounds. Provision grounds were set aside and organized for food cultivation by the plantation owner. In the image on the left, we see another site. A red circle distinguishes planted land on steep terrain that was otherwise unsuited to sugar production. And such mountainous slopes on Caribbean islands were often made available to the enslaved for growing their own food. And in contrast to plantation provision grounds, these food plots were directly managed by the enslaved themselves. And in the center, I've included a stanza from an 18th century poem written by a Scottish plantation owner on St. Kitts. It is of interest for advising that slaves be given mountain grounds or waste broken land for their own food cultivation, and allowed a day each week to tend the plots. On plantations where this privilege was granted, it was known as slaves' independent production. Some 18th century observers, and here is Professor Mark Harris's beautiful image of this. On some 18th century European observers took note of the subaltern food system developed by the enslaved. C.G.A. Oldendorp, a Moravian missionary to the Danish West Indies in the 1760s, mentioned the diverse food crops that the enslaved cultivated together in their subsistence plots. Of those he listed, we now recognize many of the plants are of African origin. In pre-revolutionary Haiti, this African inflection in slave food gardens caught the attention of a French official who called them Petite Guinées, referencing Guinea, a name widely used for Africa at the time. Such humble food plots located in the interstices of plantation economies became, in effect, the botanical gardens of the Atlantic worlds dispossessed. And here are some of the plants of African origin that were mentioned by Oldendorp. It has 1987 for when it was translated from Danish to English, but it goes back to the 18th century. It was on such modest food plots that slaveholders and naturalists encountered for the first time many unfamiliar tropical crops of African origin. With no name for these novel food and medicinal plants, the African words for them entered colonial languages, and this table lists a few linguistic borrowings in English and Portuguese from African loanwords. Among the English words derived from African languages are yam. In many of the West African languages, it means to eat. Okra, kola, and beni for sesame, all are derivatives. Throughout plantation societies, the enslaved continually pressed for the right to grow food on plots they could independently manage. When conferred, independent production meant the slaveholder no longer had to provide or pay for daily food rations. But while the arrangement put the enslaved entirely in charge of their own subsistence, it established for them an important convention: time each week exempted from plantation work to tend their food plots. It wasn't much in terms of an exemption, and we've heard about even at night, many people tried to grow and cultivate their crops during that time. But nonetheless, this modest grant of labor autonomy secured for the enslaved the right to benefit from any surpluses that could be bartered or sold, including small food animals in weekly markets. Decades ago, scholars Sidney Mintz and Douglas Hall made the important point that slaves' independent production supplied regional food networks in plantation societies with the only available fresh produce and meat, which were otherwise imported or in limited supply. But I would like to add another observation, that these slave food gardens can also be seen as sites of liberatory practices and resistance, which would prove indispensable in the long struggle for autonomy and freedom, a point that Sylvia Wynter has also made. For these food plots provided the seeds and root cuttings that runaways took with them when they fled bondage. In plantation societies where frontiers had not yet closed, fugitives were at times able to band together and form maroon communities in areas beyond colonial control. This is the first image of maroonage in the Americas. A few maroon communities managed to survive across many generations, despite the constant threat of discovery by militias sent to re-enslave them. And this sketch from 1727 is an eyewitness drawing of a Dutch militia's destruction of a maroon hamlet in the interior of Suriname. And note here the mastiff, the large dogs being sent in pursuit, and coding people of African descent in the striping here to indicate it, and women carrying pouches, which some have wondered, could that be seeds that they are carrying as they flee re-enslavement? Despite the success of the militia in raising this particular Maroon community in 1727, the colonial government failed to eradicate entirely these communities, and today the descendants of these runaway slave communities make up 27% of Suriname's population. Other drawings of vanquished fugitive settlements illustrate where Maroon communities were sited and document the foods they grew. These 18th century images show the importance of a permanent source of fresh water. I'm thinking of Chandra here with this one. And the affinity for planting African food crops such as rice, yams, and plantains. For runaway slaves, self-liberation and survival depended vitally on providing sufficient food for the community's survival. In Amazonic Brazil, where I've carried out a lot of research, thousands of slaves fled rice and cotton plantations for refuge within the uncharted Amazon rainforest. The Maroon settlements they formed, as I mentioned earlier, are known in Portuguese as quilombos. Government militias sent in pursuit at times recorded the crops quilombolas harvested. And on the list, you see, I've gone through some of these expeditionary reports. I've put some of the plants that are reported as being grown that they often were set fire to or just appropriated by the militias once they took over the community. And I've put in bold those foods of African origin. You can see, again, that inflection of an African food system into these New World creolized systems, established first on slave food crops and then reestablished in larger scale in these communities. And these plants then reveal the diffusion of the slave subaltern food system from the plantation to fugitive slave communities, so that the community's food fields, the Maroon community food fields in a sense, can be understood as an extension or scaling up of the slave food plot. And here we turn to yet another image. Brazil abolished slavery in 1888. The last country in the Western Hemisphere to do so. After emancipation, the mixed crop agricultural practices of both the enslaved and Maroons endured. These farming strategies became the foundation by which freed persons sought to escape new forms of labor exploitation and reimposed racial hierarchies. From the 1960s to the 1980s, geographers and anthropologists began a systematic study of Afrodescendant peasant farms in the New World tropics, particularly in the Caribbean. They drew attention to the farming system's emphasis on agrobiodiversity and sustainability, even though neither of these terms had yet come into use. And here are two representative Afrodescendant farms where some 20 to 30 different crops were interplanted. This Afrodescendant food system is still practiced today, and what appears as vegetative chaos is actually a carefully cultivated, highly efficient food garden. The variety of crops strategically placed horizontally as well as vertically protect and enrich fragile tropical soils by creating and concentrating nutrients and biomass. And such agrobiodiversity is typically achieved without chemical inputs such as pesticides and inorganic fertilizers. Today, there is a renewed interest in Afrodescendant farm systems in tropical America, especially as is practiced in maroon communities. And a recent study of one quilombo polyculture in Brazil registered 84 species and land races grown together on a few hectares of community farmland. These Afrodescendant farms harbor deep reserves of agroecological knowledge, shaped and maintained during centuries of hardship and experimentation. They have been tested under oppressive regimes of slavery and post-slavery histories of Black dispossession. This legacy speaks powerfully to the resilience of these agroecological systems. Yet, Afrodescendant farmers across the Americas continue to struggle to hold on to land that they've farmed for generations. Entire maroon communities have faced land grabs for dam projects, industrial mining operations, timbering, large-scale agro-industrial monocultures. And one area where these tensions play out prominently is in the ongoing quilombo struggle in Brazil to obtain legal title to their legacy farmland. Although explicitly promised in Brazil's 1988 constitution, legal recognition of their land has proceeded at a glacial pace. Since then, of the 3,500, approximately, quilombo communities who have registered their collective holdings, the federal government has granted titles to only 494 of them, a mere 7% of the total petitioned. But of course, a similar process of land dispossession has long been at work in Suriname, of course, as well as in the United States. And in the US South, 14% of all farms were under Black ownership in 1910, according to the Agricultural Census. These farms represent the legacy of the Black agricultural system that emerged after the Civil War. That number has today declined to just 2% of all registered farms, with most of the loss occurring in many of our people present today's lifetimes, 1960s and 1970s. Despite this, a resurgence of artisanal farmer initiatives is well underway to revive and market heritage seeds, grains, and crop varieties that have remained in Black communities for generations, and we happily have heard about some of those today. So, towards the end here, dependence upon fossil fuels, GMOs, agrochemicals, and machinery sets apart our contemporary era of plantation monocultures from its earlier slave-based incarnation. Nevertheless, oppressive racialized hierarchies continue to bookend what some refer to as the Plantationocene era, even if they appear today in a different guise. And this is because the historical and socio-ecological residues of plantation capitalism are ever present in contemporary patterns of land use, species extinction, resource conflict, and Black dispossession. In contrast, Afrodescendant heritage farms defy this history of racial capitalism while pointing the way towards a more sustainable food system. These farms have been tested over centuries in multiple environments and under some of the most trying socio-ecological circumstances humanity has ever faced. And this brings me to a final point about migration and food. One of the things that's always struck me is how much work has been done on the foodways of various migratory waves of various ethnic people, but very little has actually been devoted in terms of how did this happen under the African diaspora, which today I've tried to tell you the steps by which these foods are loaded as provisions on slave ships, and then through the agency of the enslaved themselves, occasional opportunities to take them off the ship, smuggle them off, and reestablish them in gardens, how that process occurred. So a critical feature, I would argue, of human migration the world over is the continuity of traditional food preferences across space and the dislocations of geography, that the migration of Africans was compelled through extremes of violence and privation does not diminish this universal desire or preclude the possibility of achieving it. African crops enabled the enslaved to reinstate some food traditions of specific cultural heritages and to combine ingredients in new ways with Amerindian and European foods. In this way, the enslaved discreetly broke the monotony and shortfalls of the food regimens slaveholders typically imposed. Africans and their descendants profoundly shaped the foodways of plantation societies. Through the dishes that enslaved female cooks prepared for slaveholders, African foods stealthily made their way onto planters' tables. In this way, the African crop introductions encouraged the distinctive and today much celebrated regional cuisines that developed across plantation societies. Consider rice-based dishes such as hop and john made with African black-eyed peas, okra-based gumbos, jambalaya, and pepper pot stews, fritters made with black-eyed peas, or carragé, or plantains, collards, and other greens. These are the celebrated foodways of Charleston, New Orleans, Salvador, Veracruz, Mexico, and other parts of the African diaspora. Africa's food heritage in the Americas is built upon this not yet fully acknowledged foundation. So to conclude, the cultural history of plants and their entangled links with human societies asks us to be attentive to the places and spaces where the disenfranchised have or are able to challenge dominant food orders. Moreover, it reminds us of the significance of food for ongoing realizations of autonomy and freedom, not only in the African diasporic history I've discussed this evening, but also in current efforts by food insecure people living in urban food deserts of the Americas to repurpose public spaces for growing healthy food. And this final image, we talked earlier today about guerrilla gardening. This is gangsta gardening. This final image is from where I live in Los Angeles. It illustrates how Afrodescendant agricultural heritages continue to take root in unexpected places. Here we encounter LA's guerrilla gardener, gangster gardener as he likes to call himself, Ron Finley, who plants broken city sidewalks and abandoned urban lots with a tangled medley of crops, a polyculture, for the food insecure to harvest. So to conclude here is when we pay attention then to where such plants are emplaced in rural and urban landscapes, it allows us to actually think through and against the Plantationocene and to imagine and enact food futures that can be simultaneously climate resilient, ecological, participatory, equitable, and responsive to persistent racial injustice. Thank you.